that I'm not used to. I've done a lot of interviews, but mine is more sort of expressive. Anyway, look, my name is Brij Lal. I was born in Fiji. I was educated in Fiji, Canada, and Australia. And at present, I am a professor of Pacific and Asian history at the Australian National University. I'm in Fiji briefly to conduct some research on two projects I'm working on. One is the life of the former leader of the opposition, Mr. Jahaji, and the other one is the voyages of indenture, the 87 ships which came to Fiji between 1879 and 1916, and the kinds of things that happened on the ship, the social and cultural transformation that took place on the ship, because that is really the first major traumatic experience for the indentured laborers who are coming to Fiji. So that is what I'm working on at the moment.
So what did you find out so far? What did you research?
Well, basically, as you know, I have been working on the history of indenture, history of Girmit since the late 1970s. My PhD was on the social and economic origins of the indentured laborers who came to Fiji from North India, embarking, at Calcutta, coming to Fiji. Then later on, I began to work on aspects of the indenture experience in Fiji, looking at, for example, suicide, looking at the issue of gender exploitation, looking at the issue of strikes, trying to fathom the manner in which people experienced indenture, trying to understand how they coped with the demands and the rigors of plantation life. I suppose my fundamental conclusion is this, that indenture was a very harsh experience, difficult experience, but one cannot compare the experience of indenture in Fiji with the experience of indenture, let's say, for example, in the Caribbean. I argue that indenture was a limited detention, not a life sentence. That at the end of 5 or at the most 10 years, our people were free, were able to eke out an existence on their own as farmers, as laborers, and so on. And the kind of cultural fragmentation, the kind of social and cultural breakdown that took place, for example, in Guyana or Trinidad and so on, did not take place here. Our people were able to preserve their language, their culture, their food. And from the 1930s onwards, you have Hindi movies coming to Fiji. And I think Hindi movies played an enormously important role in preserving our language, our culture, our traditions, and so on. Also, really, from the 1920s, 30s, 40s onwards, you have Hindi newspapers. Jagriti, Fiji Samachar, Jai Fiji, and so on. So that link with our culture was never ruptured to the extent that it was in the Caribbean. And I find that also the emergence of a free society on the fringes of plantations, because once indenture, they expired, people were free to do what they wanted to do. And after 5 or 10 years, you have the growth and development of free settlement in various parts of Fiji, in the present sugarcane belt of Fiji. And that, to those who still remain on the plantations, was a very powerful symbol of hope that one day they too would be free. So I see the indenture experience in Fiji as a story of fragmentation and reconstitution, incorporating aspects of the old with aspects of the new, what they encountered in Fiji. And so you have the emergence in Fiji of a distinct culture, of a distinct society, which is different to any other society formed by indentured migrants. We have our own language. We have the growth of a very egalitarian society. People were, caste, hierarchy, protocol did not matter as much as individual initiative and enterprise. And there's one other factor that I think is very important to bear in mind, and that is the presence in Fiji of an indigenous population. An indigenous population whose rights were protected at law. So we were not allowed to intermix with these people culturally and socially, which I think is hugely detrimental as far as the long-term future of this country is concerned. This complete isolation, encouraged by the government. But it also meant that our people, once their contracts had expired, they had to rely on their own resources. There was no government help at all. It came in the 30s and 40s in the form of assistance to schools and so on. So our people established cultural and social organizations, the Arya Samaj, Sangam, Muslim League, and so on, to impart some cultural values and principles of the religion, values of the religion to the people. The second thing that our people realized very early on was the value of education. So every major settlement had a primary school and later a secondary school, because they realized that there was no future on the farm for all the people in the family. After all, this was leased land in many cases, and it is in the nature of leased lands that leases expire one day. So from this very humble beginning came a people full of desire to improve themselves, to create a future for themselves in this country. And I think that the indenture experience, you see, is hugely important in trying to understand the dynamics of this new society. I think it will be fair to say that until about, say, 25, 30 years ago, until 1979, the 100th anniversary of the arrival of our people in Fiji, there was very little consciousness of indenture, of the history of our people. There was almost an element of shame associated with that past. People did not want to know about that past. It was a period of darkness, best left unexplored to the fading pages of history. But after 1979, when some of us began doing serious research, and our people began to become aware of who they were, where they had come from, that there was a sense of renewed interest in and pride in the background. And now, virtually every fortnight, I receive requests from people wanting to know about their past, about their roots, about their grandparents. You go to the archives and you see people from overseas looking for records of their ancestors. I suppose there is within all of us somewhere a deep human desire to know who we are, where we have come from. It's a long-winded answer to your question.
It's excellent. It's very good. I'd like to ask a question. Let's talk about your books. How many books you have? 2 books.
About 20.
20 books. How many books have you written?
I have written quite a few books. I've edited quite a few books, because I see myself, my role as a research professor in 3 ways. One, that I should do fundamental research of my own, which I have done. The second role I see is encouraging other people to write, and that is how my edited books come along. And the third thing I see important is trying to train the next generation. My very first book was called Girmitiyas, the origins of the Fiji Indians, and I was very conscious that I should use the word Girmitiya. If people want to know about my people, they ought to know what this word means. My last book on indenture and the experience of indenture is called Chalo Jahaji. And again, I want people to know what Jahaji means. Jahaji is a very important concept for Girmitiyas, because you see, these are people who are recruited individually. They are coming from the villages, then to the district depot, and from there they're taken to the port of embarkation, whether it's Calcutta or Madras, and from there, through to Fiji. Before the 1904, you had sailing ships coming to Fiji, and they could take anywhere up to 3 months. And after 1904, you have the advent of steam navigation, and ships take about a month. But whether it was a 1 month or 3 months, the journey was an extremely traumatic one for people who had never seen water before, sea. And so in that confined cabins of those ships, old customs and ways of doing things broke down. You're eating food cooked by unknown hands. You're sleeping next to a person whose social background and caste and so on you didn't know. It was impossible to observe rituals and ceremonies associated with life cycle. It was a lonely and frustrating and despairing journey. So what happened was, people began to form new kinds of associations, and this was called Jahaji Bhai. Jahaj means ship, and Bhai means brother. The brotherhood of the crossing. And so you have in this relationship a relationship as intense and as powerful as real kinship, blood kinship. And in times of sorrow, in times of hardship, Jahaji Bhais stuck together. I recall growing up on a farm in Lambasa, some of my grandfathers, Jahaji Bhais, traveling long distances to meet with each other, and they used to cry. It was a very emotional kind of experience for them, because they had left their families behind in India, and this was a new family. And indeed, you didn't marry the sons and daughters of Jahaji Bhai because they're almost like your own blood kinship. You can. So that's why I use the word Jahaji, and I want people to understand what Jahaji means. Another of my books is called Crossing the Kalapani. Now, Kalapani is a very crucial concept in understanding the nature of that migration experience. And so, I've been, in a sense, really, my interest in all of this arises from my memory of my childhood. I grew up on a farm. My grandfather was an indentured laborer. He died in May 1962. I was, for some strange reason, I was his favorite grandchild. So as a child growing up in a village, I used to see these funny people all dressed up in strange clothes, dhoti and kurta and pagdi, speaking a strange language. And my interest in things of that kind, things, the past, I suppose in some way comes from that. And I wanted to find out really who these people were. Why did they come thousands of miles away from their homeland? What happened? These people seem to me to be torn, divided. Their body was in Fiji, but their soul was anchored in their villages in India. And so that was the reason why I took up for my PhD, this research on the social, economic and demographic background of our people. And one of the things when I began my research, one of the things that the colonial records told us, that these were riffraffs, flotsam and jetsam of humanity, picked up from the streets of Calcutta and Madras and brought to Fiji. Therefore, it was argued they really didn't deserve, to be given their rights in quotes. My research absolutely conclusively proved that these people were a fair cross-section of rural India. There were among them cultivators and laborers, high castes, middle castes and low caste, a representative cross-section of rural Indian society. And for this research I spent a year in India, traveling in the villages from where these people came, living in the villages, talking to people. Now, you see, the indenture experience, people talk about whether they were kidnapped, whether there was fraudulence in the migration, or whether people left voluntarily. I think it's a mixture of both. Now, if you look at the history of rural India in the 19th century, there's a great deal of migration taking place. People from Uttar Pradesh going to Assam tea gardens, to the Calcutta jute mills, to Bihar coal mines, looking for employment. Huge amount of internal migration taking place. And my argument is that people who came to Fiji or went to other sugar colonies came from this uprooted mass of humanity on the move. So migration to Fiji or other indentured destinations was really a continuation of this process of migration that was taking place in India. And I would argue, contrary to what people believed, colonial officials believed, I believed our people were full of enterprise and initiative. Things were hard in India. Well, let's go overseas and see. There's a sense of inquisitiveness, sense of adventure, and so I would not see our people, our forebears, as people devoid of agency. I think they knew what they were doing, and when they came here, they worked very hard. It was a very difficult time. But many stayed back for a whole variety of reasons, and including the fact that making that long journey back to India, they said no, thank you. We have had one crossing, and that's enough. Plus, also, of course, the government wanted to create a dependable pool of local labor supply, so the government actually encouraged those whose contracts had expired to stay back in Fiji. In the end, I think something like 24,000 of the 60,000 went back, but the majority stayed on.
It's good, it's very good, coffee, detailed information. Okay, let's go back. Start from India. You spend, let's start about what type of caste of people were coming, you think the British had a monopoly of getting a specific caste, or just anybody who wants to go, or what? How they decided who's going?
Okay, now you have the system set up like this. In Fiji, you have the CSR company from the 1880s onwards, and they want indentured labor. So what they would do is they would prepare a list, a requisition list, and give it to the government. And so the government would then say, well, this year we need 1,600 or 2,000 workers. And that list or the number would be conveyed to the immigration agent based in Calcutta or Madras. And this immigration agent was in fact an employee of the government of Fiji. So the immigration agent would then sort of hire recruiters who would then go out and recruit in eastern Uttar Pradesh or Madras. The people who came to Fiji and went to other colonies did so on the basis of an agreement from which the word Girmit comes. And that agreement said, that you'll work for 5 years, or 5.5 days a week. You'll be given a certain amount of ration for the first 6 months and so on. Men would be given 12 pennies a day, women 9 pennies, so on and so forth. So it was a contractual sort of matter. Of course, on the ground here, the contract was not always honored for reasons that you'll understand. But there was a contract, and they came as, the government brought them to Fiji. And it was government's responsibility to make sure that rules and regulations governing indenture were applied. Now, the question you asked about the social background, you see, there is something called an immigration pass. And an immigration pass contains information about the person, his or her caste, name, next of kin, place of origin, the village, the thana, the police station, and so on. So that in the event that somebody wanted to send money back to their relatives in India, they could do so on the basis of information provided in the immigration pass. What I did was to go through each and every one of those 45,000 immigration passes. And I put that data, analyzed that data using the computer for my PhD thesis. So I know precisely the social and demographic background of people who came to Fiji. The government was essentially looking for people who, from working background, farmers, agriculturists, peasants, laborers, and so on. They did not want high caste people. And yet, really, in many cases, high caste people also gave, the caste as one that's a lower one, rather than the true one, which was the caste. A classic example would be someone like Tota Ram Sanad. Tota Ram Sanad was a Brahmin. But because the government didn't want people who didn't have that kind of agricultural experience, he registered as a Thakur. He came to Fiji in 1893, I think, and worked in one in Bokasi, which is in Nosori, and went back to India sometime, I think in 1914 or thereabouts, and wrote a very famous book called Fiji Mein Mere 21 Varsh. And the stories that he related in that book provided a very powerful ammunition in the abolition of indenture. So a whole cross-section, a representative cross-section of rural Indian society was represented in the emigrating population.
Good, excellent. So let's talk about, if somebody who decided who wants to go to Fiji, how when they were transported from the villages? They took the bus, they took the car, train, or whatever. How they went, and what happened in Calcutta, Madras? What happened there?
Well, okay. Let's say you have an Arkati. Arkati is an unofficial agent of the recruiter. Let's say he goes to Basti. Basti was the district that provided the largest number of indentured migrants from North India, particularly after late 1890s, early 20th century. So let's say he would collect about 12 or 13 people. He'll take them to a safe house, a house where people who have been enticed into the recruiters' nets they'll be fed and clothed and so on. And then they would be taken to the district magistrate later on when the sufficient number was collected, for the district magistrate to satisfy himself that these people were migrating voluntarily. So they would be interviewed. It was a perfunctory kind of interview. You don't expect a very lengthy, because the district magistrate was a busy person. But nonetheless, that process took place. And quite a few people were rejected at that point. Now, those who passed the magistrate's, the examination, so to speak, would be then, put on a train and taken to, say, for North India, to Calcutta. There was a depot at a place called Garden Reach in Calcutta. Now, this depot was shared by a number of Indian indentured labor importing colonies like Guyana and Trinidad and so on, because different colonies recruited at different times because of the weather conditions on the voyage, on the voyage out. So sometimes, sometimes you have the same person recruiting for Fiji and later for Trinidad and so on. So at the depot in Calcutta, it could last for, who knows, 2-3 weeks maybe. And there again, people were examined by the protector of immigrants, by a medical officer, and those who were certified fit for manual labor and met the other criteria would then wait for the ship to come. Those who were deemed unfit for physical labor, or who for some reason had changed their minds, would then go back to the villages. And they would be waiting for ships to come, and after a while the ship came, they would then be embarked. Now my own grandfather was recruited for Demerara, which is Guyana, but the ship was full. So he said, well, wait for the next one. And the next one was coming to Fiji, so he came to Fiji. So after a period of waiting, after a period of examination, these people were then shipped to the various sugar producing colonies.
Good. So let's talk now. There's also a mention of people getting kidnapped when they were recruited and taken in front of the magistrate. Also, there were people who were raped in that small community and movements. So, what do you think happened there?
Well, I think that a certain amount of fraudulence is present in any form of labor recruitment. It happens even today, as you know. And I don't deny, that some people were misled. Some people were perhaps even kidnapped. But if you put the migration of these people in the context of what was taking place in 19th century India, then I think kidnapping is not as big a factor as some people made it out to be, because as I mentioned, people were already on the move looking for jobs. And so people who came to Fiji or went to other colonies were part of this mass of humanity looking for jobs. There was abuse of women, not only in the depots but on the plantations, both by Indian men as well as by European overseers. No questions about that. No questions. The disproportion of the two sexes caused a great deal of social tension, social problems. But I think one has to put these things in the proper perspective. Rather than, there are sensational cases of attempted rapes and so on. But what happened day in and day out on the plantations, in the fields and so on, people going about their jobs. So I mean, what I'm saying is that there was abuse in the system. There is always abuse in these sorts of things. But I'd like to think that that in the end, I mean, our people survived. Not only survived, they triumphed over the adversities of life. They encountered those hardships and triumphed. And that, to me, is the real legacy of indenture.
Okay. Were there any children, I mean, and gods too, I mean, and why they brought Indians to start with? Why not any other culture, any other country?
Well, you see, Fiji was importing indentured labor from the Pacific Islands, from the Solomons, and from other Pacific Islands. But the problem was that twofold. One was that the Pacific Island labor trade was morally tainted, because people felt, and particularly missionaries reported, that this was essentially a blood-soaked kind of trade and should stop. And that was the first reason. The second reason is that the kind of economic development that Sir Arthur Gordon had in mind when he became the governor of Fiji in 1875 required an enormous injection of capital and labor. And it was felt that Pacific Island labor supply would not be enough. It is also important to bear in mind that Sir Arthur Gordon, the first substantive governor of Fiji, had been governor of Trinidad and Mauritius before coming to Fiji. So he had already seen the operation of the indenture system in these colonies before he came to Fiji. And he was, it made sense to turn to India, because India, after all, was part of the British Empire.
Do you think that there were any children?
Oh yes. I mean, you have individuals, you have single men migrating, you have single women migrating. You also have families migrating. Families, is a husband and wife, or mother and father and children, or mother and children. I forget the exact figures at the moment, but quite a few women came as members of families. It makes sense, because you see sometimes, and especially in times of hardship, these people who had been looked after were tossed out to fend for themselves. Maybe the husband had left, migrated to Calcutta or to some other colony, didn't come back, and there was no one to look after the children and the wife, and so again they too were forced to leave. So yes, I mean, a lot of children came, and children, of course, were also born on the voyages out. So yes, families came, and in Fiji they worked. The children over the age of 10 could work doing basic kind of work on plantations. So yes.